Hello Internet users, and welcome back to Unused Content, the amazingly named show that has somehow amassed a following. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you probably have an interest in Pokemon or leftover content in games. Or maybe you just type the word mediocrity into the search bar, but either way, you've come to the right place. Today we're going to be talking about the one subject you've all been asking me to cover for months now, the third generation of Pokemon. Specifically, for this episode I'm going to be focusing on the original Hoenn games, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. And just like the previous two generations, there's a lot of interesting stuff to cover. In general, Pokemon as a series has a lot packed into it during development, which can result in many features or ideas getting thrown out in the process. However, instead of being completely deleted, there are still some relics of such things that get left over on the data of the final product. The first of which I'll mention involves Pokemon abilities. Known for being somewhat of a reboot of the franchise, one of the biggest game changers that we saw in Generation 3 was the addition of abilities. Anyone who's played a Pokemon game in the past decade should be well aware that every Pokemon, whether they be caught in the wild or hatched from an egg, comes with an ability. But based on something found within RSE's data, it seems that was not always planned to be the case. There is unused data that refers to something that is titled No Special Ability. The game uses number identifiers to handle which Pokemon has which ability. This text shows up when said identifier number is set to 00. This unused function seems to imply that the developers didn't always plan to have every Pokemon come with an ability. However, it's also just as likely that this was simply a placeholder while all of the game's abilities were in the process of being programmed. And while we're on the subject of abilities, there is one other thing I'd like to bring up. Out of all the abilities, there exists a single one that is never used anywhere in the game. This ability is known as cacophony. Outside of the name, this ability is exactly the same as another one called soundproof, which, as the name implies, nullifies sound-based attacks. You might immediately guess that the reason it goes unused is due to it being a clone of an already existing one. However, the final release of the games contained multiple abilities that did exactly this, making it strange for cacophony to be the only one that was scrapped. The word cacophony refers to an aggressive, noisy mix of sounds. This has led many to theorize that this unused ability was originally intended for the Whismur family, all of which possessed the soundproof ability in the final game. The reason for this ability to be the only one that didn't make the cut is not known, but in every generation after 3, cacophony is nowhere to be found on the data of any Pokemon game. Moving on to the next bit of info, we have something that is a little more well known by this point, but still worth talking about. There exist unused music tracks within the games. A good chunk of them are slight variations or obvious test tracks of music that you'll normally hear in the game, but the real attention grabber is the few tracks that come from the previous games in the series, Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Appearing with the Hoenn game style of music, the following music tracks from Generation 2 can be found in RSE's data. The encounter music for Suicune, Entei, and Raikou, the music for Team Rocket's invasion of the radio tower, Saffron City, the themes used for Route 38 and 39, and finally, the theme for the Pokemon Communications Center, which was an area exclusive to the Japanese version of Pokemon Crystal. The majority of the unused Generation 2 tracks are listed in the data before any of the used Generation 3 tracks. One interesting exception is the Team Rocket track, which is listed in the very last place instead. Although I'd really like to believe there were originally plans to have the player visit Johto in a similar manner to how you could visit Kanto in the Generation 2 games, it's pretty obvious that these were only used as test tracks. Perhaps this was to test the Game Boy Advance's sound capabilities, which was new hardware when development on the games had started. And speaking of the early stages of development, we've got some unused text that reveals a few interesting things about what was on the minds of Game Freak. Of course, there are some leftovers that clearly were just for testing out certain features, some of which actually even state that they are test messages. One of these deserves another look though, as within it you can see that in reference to what is supposed to be the game's title, you can see that it says, "Welcome to the world of Pokemon AGB." AGB stands for Advanced Game Boy. At the time that this text was included, the Game Boy Advance had yet to be officially revealed to the public. It seems that Pokemon AGB was a placeholder name for the project until the names of Ruby and Sapphire versions were decided upon. Another neat bit of unused text makes reference to the multiplayer communication area found within Pokemon Centers. Likely, these were just more early placeholders, but the welcome messages for the multiplayer areas in Generation 2 can be found in RSE. The most noteworthy thing here is the inclusion of the time capsule. Any veteran player can tell you that Generation 3 games lacked any means to communicate with Generation 1 and 2 games, a fact that saddened many a gamer when they were young. Although I strongly doubt it myself, it may be possible that at one point Game Freak had attempted to create some way to transfer Pokemon from the older games onto the new ones they were developing. One thing that the third generation introduced to the series was double battles. However, it was not until the fourth generation on the DS that the feature to encounter double battles in the wild was added. Within RSE's data, though, we can find a string of text that seems to have been meant for displaying when encountering two Pokemon at once. Although that bit of text seems to be as far as they got with it, this proves that wild double battle encounters were on the minds of the developers at some point. And to end off this discussion about text, I just want to mention this one right here. What should I do for fun today? I have no idea what the context it was originally supposed to be viewed in, but I just love how mixed in with all these dummy messages is just some random NPC asking you what they should do for fun today. Next, let's talk about everyone's favorite Pokemon feature ever, Pokemon contests. Just kidding, these were stupid, nobody wanted to do them, and Game Freak knew it. Why else do you think that in Emerald version, all but one of the contest halls were replaced with the battle tents? Because they clearly realized it's more fun to have your pets fight to the death than to make them do whatever this is supposed to be. But anyway, if you've ever played any of the Hoenn games, you'll know that every move in the game has a sort of secondary type that is only applicable to Pokemon contests. Strangely enough, this includes the move Struggle. Because Struggle can only be used when a Pokemon runs out of PP for all of its moves, it cannot occupy a move slot, and in turn cannot be used in a Pokemon contest. So naturally it makes very little sense for it to possess any properties that would relate it to this mode. On a previous episode where I discussed the unused content of the Generation 2 games, I brought up how the shiny version of the Pokemon Mew is technically impossible to get. The reason for this was because the only way to legitimately obtain one was through live distribution events, where each one had predetermined values that always resulted in a normal colored Mew. Well, while it sort of did become possible to encounter a legitimate shiny Mew in Emerald version, in the case of all 5 of the Generation 3 games, there is a single Pokemon that is 100% impossible to get as a shiny, due to the same reasons as Mew was in the previous generation. What I'm referring to is the mythical Pokemon, Celebi. All other mythical Pokemon, even the ones that required attending live events in order to gain access to where they reside, still had the chance to be shiny, as the game randomly generates values upon starting an encounter with them. This even includes the Pokemon Jirachi, who at the time was only obtainable in Ruby and Sapphire by transferring from a special GameCube disc that was only available to those that pre-ordered Pokemon Colosseum. Sadly, based on all the information I could find, it appears that to this day, there is still no way to obtain a legitimate shiny Celebi, and like with Mew in Generation 2, the only reason it even has a shiny color alt was to maintain consistency with the rest of the Pokemon in the game. Well, at least there was that one that appeared in the story of Mystery Dungeon 2. Aside from this one shiny Pokemon though, the Hoenn games still have a few other unused sprites buried within them. For instance, on the Acropike, the one thing the player is able to do is perform a bunny hop on the back wheel, but for some reason there exist sprites for both the male and female characters doing a bunny hop on the front wheel. There's no possible way to perform this in-game, and the reason for its inclusion on the cartridge is unknown. And to add to the mystery, a few years later, with the release of Emerald version, this sprite set was altered to match the new design of the player characters, even though it still remained completely unused. At the start of the game, the player is prevented from leaving Littleroot Town until they have a Pokemon of their own. However, if we hack our way past the event triggers, we can go out and explore Hoenn anyway. The first thing that you might notice is that Professor Birch here is stuck in a ledge. It seems that his sprite and the Poochienas are in this set position in this area until the cutscene of the professor being chased is loaded. But forget that, the real fun lies just ahead. Since we're never supposed to be beyond this point without a Pokemon, some interesting things can occur in this game when we attempt to do things that would require you to have one. For example, when you run into a wild battle, the game will force you to toss something out, even though you actually don't have anything to put out. What shows up is this weird question mark thing. It's at level 0 and doesn't have any hit points. Attempting to use the fight or run options in battle will lead to the game displaying a message that the player is out of usable Pokemon, making you instantly lose. From this point on, I'll be referring to this question mark as blank, as the game displays its name as just a blank space. I know, I'm a genius, right? Because we have not properly received a Pokemon yet, we are unable to check the stats of blank like we would with any other Pokemon. However, while we are in battle with it, we can check the Pokemon menu to do it instead. What stands out right away to me is that blank has the no special ability message that I mentioned earlier, and strangely, for some reason, it is listed as being obtained in a trade. Aside from that though, there isn't much else to see. True to its name, everything else on blank's summary screen is, well, blank. Attempting to check any of its moves will freak the game out and force a reset though. As well, moving around too much on the empty party screen can result in some glitchy effects. I got a little curious about what else I could do with this thing, so I decided to mess around with some more things in the game. Progressing far enough to obtain a TM, if you attempt to use it with blank being the only thing in your party, the game will simply state, "There is no Pokemon." Hey game, there are kids watching, don't ruin the magic for them! If you try to use the PC to store blank, you'll see that here the game displays blank with an oddly colored Bulbasaur sprite. It's likely that the game took the first sprite available to it in order to have something to represent blank. The fact that it used Bulbasaur probably has something to do with the fact that Bulbasaur is listed as the first Pokemon. As for color, that could potentially just be some glitchy shenanigans. That's all for today, but there's still a whole lot more to cover for the Generation 3 game, so make sure you come back to check out the next part once it's out. Hey everyone, thanks for watching the video. If you want to see the next one, you can hit like and subscribe if you want, or, you could just come back when I put the next one up, your decision, your decision. So anyway, originally this was going to be a two-parter series, with the first part being Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, and the second part being Fire Red and Leaf Green, but as it turned out, the Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald video was getting way too long, so I just decided to say, screw it, let's just break it up into two parts. So the whole Unused Content Gen 3 series is gonna be 3 videos long at least now. In the meantime, while you wait for the next part, you can check out some of my other videos on both this channel and my gameplay channel. You can check out my brother and I are playing a Nuzlocke on Fire Red using the Moemon mod, and as well you can also check out Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. We're having some fun doing that, but only if you want to and all that. But anyways, thanks again for watching, and have a good night, afternoon, morning, wherever it is where you are, and have yourself a nice day. Or night, or morning. Whatever, I just said that.